This is fluid coding and AI. Can one AWS agent inspect private repositories, search the web, run tests, and be physically unable to delete the wrong branch? Here is the stress test. Our maintenance agent needs 5 things: private enterprise tools, a shared mounted dataset, managed web search, shell access inside its working environment, and 1 destructive repository action protected by deterministic policy. By the end, we will know which parts AgentCore genuinely manages, which parts remain our code, and why a green policy decision is meaningless if the same effect has a side door. First, update your mental model. A review from 2025 is already stale. In spring and summer 2026, AgentCore added policy enforcement, direct and interactive shell access, EFS and S3 Files mounts, managed web search, and a generally available harness. So the current question is no longer, does AWS have these pieces? It does. The useful question is whether the pieces compose into a trustworthy agent system or merely produce a very expensive diagram with excellent icon alignment. AgentCore Runtime is a real hosting contract. Your ARM64 container listens on port 8080, handles invocations, and reports health. AWS places each runtime session in a dedicated micro VM with isolated compute, memory, and file system. Sessions can live for up to 8 hours. You also get VPC connectivity, streaming, authentication, telemetry, immutable versions, and named endpoints for rollout and rollback. That is meaningful infrastructure. But it does not decide when to call a model, select a tool, process the result, trim context, or retry a failed step. That missing loop is the difference between runtime and harness. Runtime says, bring your agent program, and AWS will run and isolate it. Harness says, declare the model, instructions, tools, memory, limits, and environment, and AWS will run the loop too. Harness is powered by Strands agents. It manages reasoning and tool cycles, context, streaming, and failure handling. It also includes shell and file tools. The trade-off is control. If you need a custom graph, unusual hooks, or another framework, Runtime keeps that freedom and gives the orchestration work back. Now for the result that changed my expectation. Suppose the agent asks a typed gateway tool to delete the main branch. Cedar evaluates the caller and arguments, sees a protected branch, and denies the request. Perfect. Then, the same agent opens its shell and uses a powerful Git credential to delete that branch directly. Gateway never receives the call. Cedar never evaluates it. The policy worked exactly as designed, and the system still failed. This is the central contradiction. AgentCore policy protects a gateway path. It is not a universal firewall around everything an agent can do. The fix is architectural, not grammatical. Do not keep destructive repository credentials inside the runtime. Give the shell read access, plus only the narrow write permissions needed for reversible local work or a temporary branch. Put the destructive credential behind one typed gateway tool. Block direct access to the same remote operation with IAM, network policy, and repository permissions. Then make the backend validate a signed, expiring approval that binds the exact user, repository, branch, and operation. The rule is simple: shell for reversible work, type tools for consequential remote effects. With that boundary established, the first requirement is private tools. AgentCore Gateway can expose Lambda functions, API gateway stages, Open API and Smithy targets, and remote MCP servers behind one MCP endpoint. It separates authentication into 2 legs: who may call the gateway, and how the gateway may call the target. Private MCP and Open API targets can connect through VPC Lattice. Lambda or API Gateway can bridge other internal services. So yes, private tools are supported. But the customer still owns the tool implementation, schema quality, credentials, network path. The mounted dataset is also a real yes. Runtime and Harness can mount customer-owned EFS or S3 Files access points into every session. Those mounts can be shared across sessions and agents, which fits a reference corpus, repository mirror, or shared tooling directory. EFS is the better fit when you need POSIX behavior, locks, and low-latency shared files. S3 Files fits data that already lives as objects but needs normal file system paths. There are constraints. The integration requires VPC mode, and the runtime, storage, access points, and mount targets must be in the same account and VPC. Your application still handles the For the active checkout, managed session storage can preserve a workspace across stop and resume, but it is still preview. A conservative production design can use a directory per runtime session on customer-owned EFS instead. Shell support is no longer a workaround. Harness has a built-in shell tool. Runtime exposes both one-shot bash commands and an interactive terminal that preserves its working directory and environment. That shell sees the runtime file system and mounts, so it is the natural place for Git, tests, and linters. Package those dependencies in the container. Code Interpreter is a separate For public research, AgentCore Web Search is a managed gateway connector. It returns ranked titles, snippets, links, and dates from an Amazon-operated index, and AWS requires supplied citations to remain with answers based on those results. That is useful for release notes, security advisories, and current documentation without giving the runtime broad browser access. The catch is placement. As of July 23, 2026, the connector is available only in US East 1. If that region is not acceptable, the conservative fallback is an approved search service exposed as a private gateway tool. The policy requirement gets a qualified yes. AgentCore policy attaches to gateway and evaluates governed tool calls with Cedar. It defaults to deny, lets explicit forbids override permits, and can test caller identity plus typed tool arguments. That lets us forbid protected branches, force operations, unapproved organizations, or callers without the maintenance role. Policy decisions are logged. But approved equals true is not human approval. The downstream service must prove who approved the action, exactly what they approved, and whether that approval is still valid. Cedar gates the request. A trusted system establishes the approval. A strong reference design now looks like this. Run Harness in private subnets with explicit tool allow lists and hard limits on iterations, time, and tokens. Mount a read-only shared dataset plus an isolated workspace. Pre-install Git and the test toolchain. Let the shell inspect, edit, build, and test, but deny it destructive remote credentials. Route internal lookups, web search, and the single destructive action through gateway. Put default, deny Cedar policy on that action, and pause for external approval before it runs. Finally, trace model calls, tool calls, shell commands, policy decisions, and API activity. The boundary is credible only if you can reconstruct what happened. Identity is where enterprise details stop being decorative. Use SIG-v4 for machine-to-machine calls, or OAuth and JWT when an end user's claims must reach policy decisions. Harness documentation notes that SIG-v4 invocation does not propagate a separate end-user identity for downstream credential scoping. Also assume code inside the micro-VM can reach the execution role credentials exposed through its metadata service. That is documented behavior, not an escape hatch you can wish away. Least privilege is therefore the primary boundary. Separate who may invoke the agent, what the workload role may access, and what credentials exist only behind. So, did AgentCore eliminate orchestration? Runtime did not. Harness can eliminate a large amount of loop code, but configuration becomes the system design, IAM, VPC routes, file system access points, target schemas, outbound credentials, Cedar, logs, region placement, and approval state. Cost is modular too. Compute, model inference, search, gateway, storage, networking, observability, and tool backends arrive on separate lines. And there is no public end-to-end benchmark for this repo maintenance workload. AWS has published limited platform latency improvements, but not. My verdict is yes, with boundaries. AgentCore now provides a substantive runtime contract, isolated sessions, lifecycle controls, mounts, shell access, networking, authentication, versions, and telemetry. Harness adds a genuine managed agent loop. Gateway and Cedar add a deterministic authorization point. That is more than custom orchestration moved into a settings page. It is also not a finished enterprise agent. Use Harness when your workflow fits a strand-style model and tool loop. Use Runtime when orchestration is part of your product. In both cases, remove alternate destructive paths before calling anything policy protected. If this boundary first breakdown helped, like the video and subscribe to Fluid Coding and AI for more practical analysis of agent platforms, developer tools, and the architecture behind the demos.